But now I want to move into this topic which has got me fascinated and surely most of you fascinated. And I'll be introducing Dr. Frank Golding to you, OAM. He is an honorary research fellow at Federation University Australia, where he has just completed a PhD entitled Care Levers, Recovering Voice and Agency Through Counter-Narrative. And as a life member of CLAN, the National Care Leaver Advocacy Body, a social historian, Frank has contributed to formal inquiries dealing with the institutionalisation of children, and also projects with the National Museum, the National Library of Australia, and the National Summit on Rights in Records. He has presented papers on child welfare in the UK, Ireland, Sweden, Italy, and Spain. He has written more than a dozen books, as well as book chapters and referred journal articles. He is currently working on 2 books as a means of dealing with lockdowns and creeping old age. And boy, Frank, I want to hear what you come up with about that creeping old age one, because I'm suffering. But the topic is the ignorance and cruelty of parents. So I'd like everybody to welcome to this AGM, Frank Golding.
Thank you very much, Tony. Can you all hear me clearly?
Yep.
Yes. Thank you to the also for the welcome to country. I acknowledge the Wurundjeri people, who are the traditional owners of the land on which I'm sitting today. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and of the Kulin Nation, and extend my respects to other might be there in the audience. In the paper which I'm presenting today, I don't deal specifically with Indigenous parents. That warrants a paper all by itself and is best done by Indigenous people. But I'm acutely aware that Indigenous children are nearly 10 times more likely to be living away from their families than non-Indigenous children, and overrepresentation has consistently increased over the last 10 years. I fully endorse the words of Sue Ann Hunter, the chair of Family Matters. Quote, "It's time to completely change this broken system that is not working for our kids." And I would add to her words, a broken system that's not working for parents. In my PhD thesis, I focused on the way the voices of children were in the out-of-home care system not heard, or indeed were silenced by the system. And I concluded that silence was the sound of powerlessness meeting unrestrained authority. Parents were not my primary focus in my thesis, but I was struck by the parallels in the experiences of children and their parents. The documents on children were written and controlled by bureaucrats, social workers, case managers, and so on. And so too, with some notable exceptions, were the documents written about parents. In their analysis of the first 100 years of child protection in Victoria, Dorothy Scott and Shirley Swain observed that it was almost impossible to hear the voices of the parents, quote, partly because there were few brave enough to speak, and perhaps because there were few prepared to listen with compassion. There are 2 elements in Scott and Swain's finding that mirror the situation with children. First, the gross inequalities of power that led to their intimidation, and secondly, the lack of respect exhibited by authorities. In my research, I found a dominant thread running through the fabric of child welfare history in Victoria. It's a thread of labelling, denigrating and marginalising children, constructing them as outsiders and therefore deserving no better than they got. I found that same dominant thread in relation to the parents of these children. Over the decades, welfare authorities saw themselves as standing, quote, between the child and the ignorance and cruelty of parents, hence my title, and I'll elaborate on that thing. The common label, child rescue, conveyed harsh judgments about parents whose children were rescued from them. From the time of the first piece of legislation in Victoria relevant to child welfare, which was the Neglected and Criminal Children's Act of 1864, poor parents were consistently denigrated in public reports. For example, there was a Royal Commission in 1872 which reported on the dissolute habits of families which rendered children, quote, the offspring of profligate or criminal parents who, from their earliest infancy, have been familiarized with vice and crime, often in their worst forms. And in the late 20th century, it's been found in a report that child welfare workers were still inclined to use labels about parents as dangerous, unwilling, and inadequate, parents who are unable to or not allowed to care for their children. For many years in Victoria, the annual official reports on children placed in care assigned parents to either one of two columns. They were blameless or they were blamable. The blamable included invalids and those in hospitals or asylums and those who were poor, but otherwise with acceptable cause to need their children to be looked after. Those classed as blamables, a longer list, included divorced parents and those who were drunkards, had deserted or were in jail, and parents labelled as, quote, of doubtful parentage, of doubtful character, undefined term. Historically, the faults of parents were commonly depicted as moral failings: godlessness, vice and immorality, drunkenness, slovenliness, lack of motivation. Even destitution was understood as a moral failing rather than an economic or social problem. A fundamental aim of the child welfare system was to prevent parents passing these moral faults onto their children. It was common to attribute juvenile misbehaviour and delinquency to delinquent parents. One magistrate inquiring into a mass outbreak from a New South Wales reformatory in 1961 claimed that most of the children, quote, were a product of unsatisfactory homes, broken homes, parents drunkard or disinterested, and so on. The magistrate gave no indication that he spoke to any of these parents. Presumably, he worked from files written by welfare workers, police, and children's court officials. In Victoria at that time, a researcher found that it was difficult for welfare officers not to prejudge parents because the police evidence produced in children's courts was designed to show the failings of the parents in order to convict the children as neglected. So that, quote, police reports tend to strip parents naked, showing them in their very worst character. And more often than not, the parents were not in court, sometimes because they were not even told their child was being charged. In 1963, almost 2/3 of children coming into care in Victoria were deemed under legislation to be in need of care and protection. It was a newer, softer term than the original omnibus term neglected, for which there were many euphemisms, like being exposed to moral danger, likely to lapse into a life of vice and crime, incorrigible, uncontrollable, destitute. I actually found that last term, destitute, was particularly common in South Australia. Neglect was not necessarily a description of children literally being left without adequate food, shelter, or clothing. The term was associated as much with parents' moral laxity, and that reflected the power that authorities had to make a range of subjective judgments and assessments about child rearing standards and the capabilities of parents. It must be acknowledged that some parents were neglectful or cruel and were prosecuted for their conduct. Over the years, I've gathered newspaper articles carrying court reports like "Callous Young Mother Jailed," "Jail for Parents Who Neglected Children," "Inhuman Parents Jailed." Parents were also imprisoned for reasons other than maltreatment of their children, I hasten to say. They were prosecuted for drunkenness, for example, and in cases where they were jailed, their children were then judged to be neglected. In some cases, young women in care became pregnant, and more or less automatically, as if that young mother were a criminal needing to be punished, their child was taken from them and also placed in care. As Naomi Parry points out in the case of single mothers, particularly those from marginalised groups, quote, inspectors, priests, nurses, policemen, lady visitors, activist reformers, and bureaucrats used various means to coerce families into signing their children over. The marital status of parents was one of the areas the department almost invariably recorded when they registered children coming into care. Nearly half the infants admitted to babies' homes in the 1950s and 1960s were recorded as being born to unmarried parents. However, premarital pregnancy was regarded almost entirely as a personal failing of the mother, whether their pregnancy resulted from consensual sexual activity or from rape. The shame and stigma of illegitimate birth was shared by all classes of women, but well-to-do families had more realistic options for dealing with unplanned babies. Clearly, the vast majority of illegitimate children placed in institutions were from poor families, working class women unable to cope with the unholy trinity of poverty, lack of support, and public shame. The stain of illegitimacy could last for years and rebound upon children much later. For example, in 1950, when I was then aged 12 and my brothers were teenagers, my mother wrote to the department asking for us to be returned to her. My house will stand up to any inspection at any time by anyone. Right. In reply, the department informed her that because of her, quote, irregular domestic situation with Mr. Golding, it was unable to regard your home as possessing a sufficiently reasonable moral environment to justify returning the three boys to your care. Our illegitimacy was on permanent. It had been referred to in previous correspondence almost a decade earlier. Shirley Swain argues that long-held assumptions about parents appear mutually contradictory. On the one hand, parents were assumed to be anxious to offload their children and should be deterred from doing so. A writer in the South Australian Register, for example, said he was sickened to see so many children sent to the industrial school or reformatory. He lamented, quote, the ease with which these parents get rid of their responsibilities is creating a most unwholesome frame of mind amongst a certain class of our population. And they begin to feel there is very little or no disgrace in having their children treated as criminals, and they're glad to get free of the trouble of feeding and clothing them. On the other hand, as already mentioned, parents were also seen to be malign influence on their children, and so should be kept away from them. The authorities made it very hard for parents to maintain contact with their children. Visiting parents were turned away at the door. Letters were not passed on. Siblings were assigned to separate institutions without regard for where the parents lived. My brother, then 16-year-old, in his file found a report on our parents were visiting him at the orphanage hostel. Quote, too much, rather a nuisance. That expression was double underlined in the original. Parents, too much, rather a nuisance. After I'd been in care for 4,397 days, and who's counting, I was finally discharged to my parents at age 15. Many years later, I was gratified to learn from the records that they had been dogged in their pursuit of regaining custody of us. I was fortunate, but large numbers of other parents lost all contact with their children. Former Senator Andrew Murray heard hundreds of direct accounts as a member of the Senate's 2004 Forgotten Australians inquiry, and later heard many more accounts as one of the Child Sexual Abuse Royal Commissioners. He described the deception and duplicity. Quote, children were told lies, they had no parents, or their parents had died, or didn't want them anymore. They were told they were unloved and from bad blood, the sons and daughters of whores. They were from the gutter, and that's where they would end up. In many cases, care leavers have travelled through life believing as what they were told about their parents. They were derelict, deserters, or dead, only to discover as they reached older age that their parents were still alive and had struggled in vain to retain or regain contact. Sadly, in some instances, the passage of time now makes it impossible for them to establish contact. Many children committed into institutional care were victims of the legislation of the day that punished children for the inability or unwillingness of their parents to pay maintenance. In Victoria, for example, in the first half of 1961, nearly 700 children were admitted to care, and of these, 13% were there because their parents had defaulted on their maintenance payment. My father is a case in point. Having placed his preschool-aged sons with the department in 1940, he was ordered to pay weekly maintenance of £1 out of his weekly wage of £4.13. He failed to pay that maintenance for 4 successive weeks, and under the legislation, we children then automatically became wards of the state. There was no option. Subsequently, he sent part payments until he became unemployed. He then suggested to the department that if he had his boys back, he could get sustenance, the dole, and pay you back so much a week, he said. The departmental inspector advised her superior that, quote, while there is so much work to be obtained, it does not appear right that a strong, healthy man like Golding should be drawing sustenance. Our father's proposal was then rejected. There seemed to be been little interest or nothing at all in doing anything that might have prevented neglect or ameliorated its impact or reduced the number of parents who failed to pay maintenance. The majority of parents the department dealt with came from desperately poor families. Nearly 20% of parents in the Victorian department's files were permanently unemployed in 1961 or had, quote, a marginal attachment to the labour force. As parents got on top of things and expressed an interest in having their children returned to them, they were treated with suspicion. A few that may have developed a fear that may have been developed from recurring anecdotes about parents wanting to retrieve their children only when they were old enough to earn a wage and contribute to household costs. My brother found the following note in his personal file about whether he should be allowed to complete year 10 at school. Quote, undoubtedly, all the boys will return to the mother and Mr. Golding in due course, and it's just a question of whether he should be retained and given an education at the expense of the state when his future earnings will probably be collected by the mother. The mother was not even given a courtesy of a name. While there's a body of research on the impact on children of being separated from their parents, the impact on parents who lose their children to the welfare system is not well researched. Some impacts are clear, however. Welfare authorities acted as if parents had forfeited not only their legal rights, but also their moral rights over the upbringing of their children in out-of-home care. They had no say in their children's schooling, health, or religion, nor crucially, in decisions to separate siblings from one another. In the 1960s, separation of siblings occurred in 60% of cases in Victoria. Sometimes siblings were sent to different parts of the state, making it hard for struggling parents to visit all of their children. We know not only that many of those separated children didn't see their siblings after that, but that also a large number of parents didn't see their children after they came out of care because of that separation. What of the psychological impact on parents? Nell Musgrove found throughout the historical case files from the 19th and 20th centuries, quote, there are echoes of longing, people aching for lost parents, siblings and children. And the Royal Commission in 2017 found that many parents of children in out-of-home care perceive society stereotype them as not loving or caring about their children. Contemporary research shows that many parents feel utterly powerless in the face of the system that lacks compassion and shows little concern for them as parents. In one Australian study, most of the mothers said they live with unresolved anger, guilt, shame, and despair. One mother whose child has been taken into care 20 years previously made the point in a compelling way. These are her words. Can you imagine the shame? How do you ever tell anyone they took your kids away? You don't. You just look at the pavement for the rest of your life, even though you did nothing wrong, except to have no one to help you when things got bad. But he came back when he was 18, and now I'm having to undo all the damage they did. He got into heroin in there. How does she regain her self-respect? How does she repair the damage done to her son? On the other hand, Swain has unearthed correspondence from mothers who in a crisis placed their children in care thinking it was temporary and then tried to negotiate their release when their circumstances improved. In those letters, Shirley Swain found many parents who were not active or submissive. They actively argued that ability to mother should not be judged by their ability to generate an income. They also demanded to be given reasons why they couldn't have their children back. However, in a review of the Victorian system in the 1960s, more than half the applications by parents wanting their state ward children returned to them were rejected because the authorities had formed the belief that the parents were, quote, unfit or inadequate persons. Not all parents went quietly into that night. In 1954, for example, Frida Harrison of North Melbourne wanted to regain custody of her two children, Monica, aged 11, and Vernon, aged 13, out of the reception centre in Melbourne. Frida asked permission to take her children to the cinema one afternoon. She then hitchhiked with the children all the way to Sydney. After 4 months with her children, she needed to return to Melbourne, whereupon she was arrested, charged with repossessing her own children, and sentenced to 14 days in prison. Happily, the sentence was suspended, and pending an inspection of her home, she was allowed to keep her children. Some might think this mother was lucky to have escaped a prison sentence for a flagrant breach of the law. Others might well think the law an ass and see the mother as a champion. In conclusion, let me come back to my work on children who were in out-of-home care and have recovered voice or are recovering their voice and agencies as adults. I suggest there's merit in mirroring or adapting some of the methods those former wards of the state have used in the past decade or so. I just throw in 5 or 6 of these suggestions, not as solutions, but as points for consideration. And no doubt you've thought about these too. Firstly, reclaiming the lost rights through the development of stronger advocacy networks of parents with lived experience, acting as parent advocates, mentors, peers, and activists. Secondly, making stronger use of the rhetoric of parents' rights. The rhetoric's all on the side of the family, the core unit of society, according to UN conventions and Australian policy documents. So, thirdly, developing a charter of rights as a tool, including visiting rights, rights to expect siblings to be kept together, rights to information about their children's health and education, how they're faring at school, right to maintain contact, and so on. You could draw up a list, as Clan has done, of 10 rights of children or former children in care. So a right for parents could be a useful tool. Challenging the historic records retrospectively. As I said at the beginning, all the documents primarily were written by other people about parents. Is it not time to turn the clock back and write your own documents? One of our clan members had a particularly interesting idea that struck me as being useful, though it might be too late for many. All parents should be encouraged, if not required, to write a letter to their children who are placed in out-of-home care, giving their account of why they're not able to raise their children. And that would undermine that those deceptive claims that parents are not interested in them or are dead. Destabilizing and challenging the conventional histories by writing their own memoirs and accounts. We've got a collection of over 150 memoirs published by care leavers, people who are formerly in care, telling their side of the story, so to speak. And I imagine that would be a very useful thing for parents to tell their side of the story. And finally, seeking redress, including apologies and counselling for historic maltreatment and breaches of rights. On behalf of those yet to enter the system, demanding undertakings that authorities will get it right in the future. So thank you very much for listening to my rant. The records that were made at the time tended to be passed from one bureaucrat or a departmental officer to another and to another and to another without a reassessment of the situation. So in the case of my parents, for example, they were in dire straits in 1940 when we were committed. But by the time the war finished and into the late 40s, they were in a much different position. But the authorities were still acting on the information that they had acquired and recorded in 1940. So there's no account taken of any change. I think that at the micro level, the level of the individual, is paralleled by the macro level, where I think the system still doesn't see the family as a unity that, or an entity that needs to be supported. Rather, there's a problem in the family, so let's take the children out of it. That's still the case, I think.
I liked the idea, Frank, that that people should tell their stories as well. I'm wondering if you could give us some reflections on that. I hope you can hear me now. I just wonder whether you can give me some reflections on the benefits of people actually being able to tell their stories and what that means to them.
Yes, I think that's a great idea, because so many people said, "I have no idea why I was in care. I went through the whole thing until I was kicked out at 15 or 16, and nobody ever told me anything about the reasons, the circumstances, um, and they bear animosity towards their parents. They blame their parents sometimes, and I think it's unfair on parents. The parents have every right to expect to have their side of the story collected in the documents. Um, it just seems to me axiomatic that you can't rely on the sole documentation produced by the social worker or the caseworker who managed that particular case at the time.
No, no, you can't, and we can't today. I mean, I think one of the major complaints that we hear from people is the way people refer to it as lying, but the fact that their issues have been distorted to some extent, and that the truth about the reasons why the kids have been taken often isn't disclosed in a way which represents the parents appropriately. Do you have any thoughts on how we could change some of that?
Yeah. Well, one of the most useful things I've found, and I don't want to sound egotistical at all about this, but getting care leavers like myself to go into professional development sessions with new or prospective social workers and new case managers and so on, to talk with departmental staff on a regular basis, and just to let them hear these stories that I've been telling you today, I think is a very important aspect. I think there's something like 38 social work courses around Australia in universities in Australia. Um, I'm very confident in saying that only a small number of those would, in fact, have as part of their syllabus input from care leavers with experience, or parents for that matter, with children in care. Experience, being able to tell them from direct experience, lived and living experience, what it's like, what are the difficulties and the harms that are done, unless you keep that close contact with the children.
Yeah.
4,397 days and nights, long days. Not all consecutive. I was committed because of my father's failure to pay the maintenance for 4 weeks in a row. I was first committed as a state ward, and when I got my files, I found that I was recommitted as a state ward. We were released on my parents' request, at my parents' request, for 9 months on probation, and then we're talking about World War, so there was disruption in many families. There was disruption in our family. So I was recommitted as a state ward again, and then left care at the age of 15 through a circumstance which is quite accidental and had nothing to do with our parents or with me for that matter. It was just a set of circumstances that meant that I had to be released, and my two older brothers had to be released from state's care. So I experienced foster care. One mother who had us for 9 days, and I found a report which said I was at 2.5 at that stage. She couldn't keep us because of our habits, not explained. Nobody can ever tell me what our habits were that made her reject us. Two other foster mothers and 3 institutions, including the notorious Royal Park Reception Centre, which was a place where they put most kids until they found them a place. And then a place called the Andrew Kerr Memorial Home in Mornington, which I have absolutely no memory of, but was documented, so I must have been there. And then to the Ballarat Orphanage, where I spent something like 11 years in the one institutions. Unfortunately, in all that time, with the exception of the very earliest stages, we 3 brothers were kept together. There was one period when there were only... So I'm speaking from experience, and of course, knocking around with lots and lots of other care leavers, people who are in care, not only in those institutions, but in other institutions and in other states. I have quite a number of friends in South Australia who are in care. So we talk a lot and we share experiences. So I'm drawing on all of that experience. And I must say, I'd given a lot of thought and over the years spent a lot of time talking about the children in care. It's only more recently that I've thought about the parents. And one of the books I'm writing at the moment is in fact about my mother's family. And it's quite an horrendous story. And where previously I might have been regarding my mother as part of my problem, being in care, I've actually turned 100% around to say she had a hell of a life. And I can understand why she would never talk about the past. But I never comprehended that, and it was never part of my understanding as a child, nor is it really found in the documents. It's found outside the document the department collected.
Well, thank you, Frank. Tony's asked me to close this off because we've been going for just about an hour now. We really appreciate you coming on and speaking to us. It's been very, very informative. We've had quite a few comments from members of the public, which Tony and I, Wendy, the others will address through our Facebook page. So, as I say, I really appreciate you coming along. I thank the people that came, joined us to watch and to comment on the on what particularly you were saying, because we got most of the comments came in after you started speaking. So obviously Tony and myself and Wendy and that, we're all boring, but you certainly were not. Thank you. I really, really appreciate it.